Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where the battle for Phantine is still raging, and where the Imperial forces under overall command of Barthol van Voytz find themselves needing to reassess their game plan. The attack upon the first of the major floating city's objectives, Sirin Holm, was expected, of course, to be a hard fight. It could not be otherwise, due simply to the nature of the objective, and the challenges innate in assaulting a hostile-held urban center solely from the air. But no one had expected it to chew up the better part of 2 regiments of Urdeshi stormtroopers. It had been assumed by everyone, the Urdeshis included, that they would have been the ideal pick for these kinds of operations. The floating mountaintop cities of Phantine would in essence be major urban centers and industrial storage and manufacturing as well as refinement yards. Close quarters urban fighting then. The exact kind of engagement the Urdeshi excelled in, partially due to their aggressive assault training and due to the fact that their own homeworld of Urdesh was a largely urbanized planet that had also been visited by chaos many times in the past, making the regiments themselves highly expert at this sort of combat. They also possessed specialized equipment like flechette blasters. Nicknamed Blitz guns by the Urdeshi stormtroopers, these compact pistol-sized weapons boast an impressive rate of fire, capable of pumping out several hundred rounds of jacketless needles. Perfect for chaotic, close-up confrontations, where aiming is decidedly secondary to getting rounds downrange. The nickname also hints at its second intended purpose. The Blitz gun is used precisely to blitz enemy positions. If you run into a bunch of hostiles hunkered down behind some crates, for example, at the other end of a corridor, normally you'd have to wait for flamethrowers, heavy weapons, or at the very least hand grenades to be brought up to engage the position effectively. But with the Blitz gun, in reality, a couple of well-trained and determined Urdeshi stormtroopers can simply sprint out from cover, firing full auto at the enemy as they run. The flechette blasters will pump out more than enough rounds to make it extraordinarily unwise for any enemy defender to poke their head out, buying the Urdeshi precious seconds to rush up to the enemy defenses and vault over them, getting into hand-to-hand combat. Another well-practiced field of expertise for the Urdeshi stormtroopers. But at Sirin Holm, they had run into an enemy every bit as determined and every bit as aggressive as they were. The Blood Pact had demonstrated an ability to not only go toe-to-toe with the best the Imperium had to offer, but to outmaneuver them on a tactical level. Fearing that they would be assaulted by overwhelming enemy forces, the Blood Pact had pulled the Imperials in to a carefully pre-planned trap, and had it not been for the miraculous intervention of a small group of lost Tarnith first and only, it is entirely possible that the Imperial assault upon Sirin Holm would not have ended in a costly victory, but in a complete catastrophe that would have seen very few, if any, survivors at all. As it turned out, however, the Blood Pact had overestimated the strength of the Imperial assault, and would thus probably have been far better off simply maintaining their earlier and superior firing positions, pinning the Urdeshi stormtroopers and all but 3 platoons of the Tarnith First and Only on the landing platforms outside of Sirin Holm's main domes, demonstrating perhaps that even if the Blood Pact had come up with an excellent strategy, they as of yet still lacked the tactical flexibility to react effectively and appropriately to unforeseen circumstances. as when the 3 platoons of Tarnith and a handful of squads of Urdeshi broke into the main Sirin Holm domes. This was the sign for the Blood Pact to begin falling back and preparing their trap, whereas a more sober estimate at the time would have seen that the small forces the Imperials had managed to infiltrate into the domes were, in all due reality, insignificant compared to the far more numerical troops still pinned down outside of Sirin Holm's domes. And the handful of troopers lucky enough to manage to get inside Sirin Holm could easily have been hunted down, surrounded, and destroyed after the main strength had been dealt with. But hindsight is as ever 2020, and honestly, the thought that it could have gone worse was cold comfort for Imperial Command, which had now been robbed both of a significant military force and the primary tools with which to seize the far larger and more important objective of Ouranberg, the Phantine capital. Plans were in motion to try to rectify this situation, but first, the invasion of Ouranberg needed to be made possible at all, and to do this, air superiority needed to be secured. The Urdeshi stormtroopers had suffered cataclysmic casualties when even just a handful of enemy skyfighters had broken into their formations during the landing operations on Sirin Holm. Even just a couple of fighters had nearly brought the entire offensive to a screeching halt. This scenario had to, at all costs, be prevented from happening again. Fortunately, the Phantine, who had grown up on this hellish world, were, if nothing else, very, very good at one thing, and that was flying. The Phantine had provided the Imperial Navy with large quantities of excellent flyers for centuries, and now that their own planet was under threat, many of them had come back or been levied from amongst the populace to liberate their world from the Chaos oppressors. And now that Sirin Holm was in Imperial hands, it could be turned into a forward operating base for the Phantine air wings. The first step was, of course, to begin initiating combat air patrols in the direction of Ouranberg, attempting to lure out enemy machines and shoot them down in hunt-and-kill fighter sweeps. Luckily for the Imperials, whilst the enemy had brought their best infantry to Phantine, the same could not be said for their flyers, as Phantine wings operating out of Sirin Holm and equipped with lightnings claimed a total of 27 kills, in return for only 2 lightnings lost. An impressive tally. Now, sure, fighter pilots do tend to exaggerate their kills, but most of these could later be confirmed via gun camera footage, and on a world like Phantine, well, merely just crippling an enemy fighter is pretty much as good as a kill. It's not like he's going to be landing anywhere or simply jumping out in a parachute either. The best case scenario for somebody shot down on Phantine would be to bail out in a special made parachute, which is in essence a hot air balloon, which will hopefully keep them hovering above the worst of the Skald for long enough for recovery flights to reach them. But in an active combat zone like this, with Sirin Holm's own auger arrays constantly sweeping the skies and vectoring in interceptors against anything that flew, well, Chaos was not carrying out a whole lot of recovery operations. Fairly soon, though, the enemy began to realize that they were no match for the Phantine in the air and fell back into a defensive posture, only launching intercept missions and shepherding the majority of their machines within Ouranberg itself. To encourage the enemy to come out and play, then, the second stage of aerial operations were launched. In addition to the usual hunter-killer patrols, Marauder bombers would begin nighttime assaults on Ouranberg, dropping 100,000 tons of bombs onto the city each and every night for 3 nights. They tried to pick their targets as carefully they could, as Ouranberg was still a major civilian center with industry that the Imperium would prefer to seize, but Sirin Holm had made it very, very clear that this was not a campaign in which the Imperium could afford to take chances. Every preparatory measure that could be taken to soften up the defenders of Ouranberg would be taken. Now, the bombing campaign's effect upon the defenders themselves was difficult to determine with any degree of certainty, and the damage to Ouranberg itself as well was hard to ascertain. They'd certainly blown up something with 300,000 tons of bombs, but whether or not any of it had been actually important, well, that was what the Imperial Guard would learn when they began invading the place later. However, the bombing campaign did achieve its primary objective, and that was to force the Chaos Air Force to rise up in an attempt to resist it, thereby making them vulnerable to the Phantine lightnings. There was also another unforeseen effect of the bombing campaign. After 3 days of aerial operations, Imperial augurs detected a large-scale aerial assault upon Sirin Holm. A mass of over 50 enemy machines were coming in, a mix of dive bombers and fighters. The Phantine squadrons rose to meet them, and over the course of a lengthy hours-long engagement, shot down 33 of the enemy machines, in trade for only 6 lightnings. Another excellent engagement for the Phantine, and a crucial weakening of the enemy's air forces. Those fighters and dive bombers would have been worth more than their weight in gold if they had been employed against an Imperial landing force. As the Imperials, due again to the unique nature of Phantine, could only move to assault Ouranberg using huge carrier dirigibles. The loss of even a single one of these would have been an enormous blow to the Imperial cause. Instead, 50 machines were thrown away on an assault on Sirin Holm with dive bombers. I remind you, the Imperium just finished dropping 300,000 tons of ordnance on Ouranberg, and still had no real idea if they'd achieved anything. And here Chaos was using a far, far lighter bomb load to attack Sirin Holm, even assuming that the enemy knew exactly where to land their ordnance for maximum effect, as they had previously occupied Sirin Holm, of course. The chance that dive bombers would inflict any serious damage on an installation the size of Sirin Holm is beyond minute. It seems more like an act of floundering desperation than anything, indicating perhaps that whilst the professionals of the Blood Pact have a degree of authority on Phantine, enough to run a local battlefront at least, they still do not have quite enough authority to dictate strategy. And speaking of the Blood Pact, the external assaults were not the only ways in which they made themselves known either. After the Imperial capture of Phantine, of course, the Imperials had begun to secure the installation as best they could. They had discovered, as we mentioned last time, the majority of the civilian population locked away and kept in storage yards and prison camps by the Blood Pact, to make sure that they would stay out of the defenders' way during the Imperial liberation attempt. These civilians had later, of course, been returned to their homes, with a few incidents here and there, but the bigger issue was that this had allowed the movement of a lot of people across a lot of Sirin Holm, and this had in turn allowed some of the Blood Pact survivors to sneak in amongst the civilians and begin to infiltrate the Imperials' holdings, to the point where, after having stolen several Tarnith First and Only uniforms from the morgue, a small group of Blood Pact were discovered attempting to steal high explosives during a resupply operation overseen by the Tarnith First and Only. Fortunately, one of the Tarnith officer, one by the name of Phagor, noticed a handful of ghosts that he did not recognize, which was highly unusual. They weren't that big of a regiment, and seeing as they were the survivors of their homeworld, one would think that they'd get to know one another quite intimately, frankly. Assuming perhaps that they were new reinforcement Verghastites, he called out to them, but they did not stop. Instead, they continued to trolley away a load of high explosives, making Phagor very, very suspicious. Insisting that they halt, the fake ghosts turned and fired on the Tarnith officer, who returned fire immediately along with other Tarnith nearby, killing the fake Tarnith. And the moment they got the uniforms off them, their heavily scarred hands made it very clear indeed that these were Blood Pact survivors. Acting immediately on his own initiative, Phagor and his immediate superior, Major Eli Mron, authorized sweeps of the area surrounding the loading base, discovering a small group of Blood Pact that had managed to secret away nearly 3 tons of high explosives that they had presumably been stocking up to use in a major sabotage operation against the Imperials. Just another reminder of the tenacity of the enemy that the Imperium was facing here on Phantine. But this apparent disunity also offered an opportunity. As Ouranberg needed to be seized with a bit more subterfuge than Sirin Holm, at least it not be seized at all, Barthel van Voytz had come up with an idea, a plan that might just save the Imperials a lot of bloodshed. The presumed overall local commander of Phantine, bearing in mind the complicated nature of Chaos command structure, was a man by the name of Sagittar Slaith. Not a whole lot was known about this individual, besides the fact that he appeared to belong to Urlok Gaur's Blood Pact, and appeared also to be one of his trusted lieutenants, one of his chief officers. No doubt he had been imbued by the Gaur with significant authority, although again, due to the complicated nature of Chaos command structure, probably first and foremost over the Blood Pact elements of the Defenders, which now after Sirin Holm were assumed to make up the majority of the enemy's force. A daunting prospect, made even more daunting by reports that apparently the enemy were also employing Loxl mercenaries. Now, the Loxl is a particularly vile creature that resembles, in essence, a large amphibious reptile. They are relatively intelligent as far as the term goes, and they appear to have no qualms with cooperating with Chaos. In fact, the ever-increasing numbers of Loxl mercenaries seen fighting alongside the Blood Pact suggest that they have reached some sort of large-scale agreement with the Gaur, either for mutual aid and protection or in return for tribute, as the Sabbat worlds are of course vast and rich in both resources and meatier rewards for these huge flesh-eating reptile things. Whatever the reason why they've decided to ally themselves with Chaos, however, the fact remains that the Loxl change the equation quite seriously. Firstly, they are excellent trackers and de facto guard dogs, with their ability to sense things rather than see them. Their eyesight is not particularly impressive, but they have a remarkable sense of taste, capable of literally tasting the air itself to discover those who do not bear the musk of Chaos. And on a world like Phantine in occupied territory, anyone who doesn't smell adequately vomitous is likely to be an outsider. Furthermore, the Loxl's naturally moist and Icarus hide is somehow resistant to lasgun fire, meaning that whilst it is entirely possible to kill one with the good old-fashioned las rifle, it will require many repeated hits, and the Loxl's are quite fast, capable even of scaling walls and sheer surfaces due to their large clawed appendages. And the Loxl's do not have the same offensive disadvantage as the Imperial Guardsmen do to them, as the Loxl's carry so-called flechette blasters. In essence, huge armor-piercing shotguns, firing thousands of tiny little razor-sharp shredding rounds capable of making a mockery out of most Imperial body armor. Now, on the bright side, it is a fairly short-range weapon, made even more so by the fact that Loxl's have a very hard time seeing out of water, their natural environment. But this is, of course, again, rather cold comfort for the Imperial Lasman who finds himself 15 feet away from one of these creatures. It was becoming increasingly obvious that a large-scale assault on Ouranberg would be a bloodbath of epic proportions, which is why now we return to the secret plan yet again. With the Chaos Commander having been identified as Sagittar Slaith, a high-ranking member within the Blood Pact and therefore presumably responsible for their local strategy and tactics, as well as, due to it being Chaos, a figure of major religious significance as well, an opportunity presented itself. Having read about Gaunt's exploits on Verghast, Berthel van Voytz now figured that he might be able to replicate what managed to win Gaunt the day during that desperate siege, the assassination of the enemy's leader. And, well, he had Gaunt and his infiltration and scouting specialists here with him now. Infiltration specialists that had spent the last few months in transit practicing stealth insertions via airdrops. Now, granted, that was via fast roping, and this insertion would require slightly more airborne methods, but still, they seemed like the perfect troops for the job. And hey, if it failed, you throw away a few dozen guardsmen, and if it succeeds, you might win the war for Phantine right then and there. Any commander worth his salt would happily take that gamble. And so, 4 assassination teams were assembled. Each team would be led by an officer, and would feature a sniper and a scout infiltration specialist, as well as a heavy weapons trooper. Although, in this case, heavy weapon means carrying a U-90, an ancient solid slug weapon firing 45 caliber rounds from a drum magazine. This trooper would of course be responsible for the security of the sniper team and the scout, and also for dealing with Loxl mercenaries, as the drum magazines would come in 2 flavors: standard anti-infantry rounds and specialized armor-piercing rounds, which would be able to take down even a Loxl quickly, or at the very least, far quicker than a lasgun would. These 4 teams would be named after a Tarnith woodland bird, a Larisel. And so we have Larisel 1, commanded by Sergeant Keglin Varl, along with Noah Vadim as the heavy weapons specialist, Jesse Banda, one of the new Verghastite's reinforcements, and a female to boot as sniper, and Bonin as the scout. Larisel 2 would be commanded by Corporal Flynn Nerin. Team security would be provided by Trooper Curran, and sniping would be done by Hlain Larkin, the entire regiment's premier marksman, and they would be led in by McVenna, one of the best amongst the Tarnith scout troopers as well. Larisel 3 would be commanded by Lurn Adar, and would have Trooper Bryn Milo on heavy weapons duty, The Verghast sniper, Nessie Bora, would take up a long-last sniper rifle, and the scout trooper Doyle would join Larisel 3. Finally, Larisel 4 was commanded by Scout Sergeant Owen McCall, the commander of the Tarnith Scouts. A remarkable risk taken by Gaunt there to send in one of his best and leading scouts into the field, but judging by McCall's personality, he probably insisted on a slot in the team. McCall would of course serve both as commander and scout, meaning that Larisel 4 had 2 security trooper, the Verghastite Nur and the Tarnith-born Kokur. And the team's sniper would be Trooper Rilk. These men would be given special training in advance of the operation, and would be inserted via grav chutes. Their training focusing primarily on how to use a grav chute, how to land on Ouranberg safely without breaking anything important, and then how to infiltrate into Ouranberg and where they would be most likely to find Sagittar Slaith. With the team selected, their missions made clear and their training underway then, the remaining problem was how to get Larisel 1 through 4 into Ouranberg. Secretly, if at all possible, as the moment the enemy realized that there were assassins in their midst, well, they'd get rather uppity rather quickly. You know? A distraction would be the best thing then, and there just so happened to be a fairly significant distraction in the offing right then and there. The bombing attacks and the preparatory operations against Ouranberg would continue on apace, but now with a small addition. See, in the coming days and weeks, one of the largest airborne operations planned would go in against Ouranberg as a final softening up before the Imperial assault. This attack would feature in the first wave alone over 600 aircraft. Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and Marauders, with the Lightnings providing top cover and the Thunderbolts providing additional fighter support, as well as ground attack capabilities if the opportunity presented itself. But the main hammering would be presented by flight upon flight upon flight of Marauder bombers. And this would merely be the softening up stage, being led in by pathfinders dropping chaff and other radar-interfering substances over the domes of Ouranberg. And once the enemy thought that the attack might be over after the first wave, a second one would sweep into the skies over Ouranberg. This one containing 300 heavy Marauder bombers, along with 24 Behemoth super heavies. This wave alone would drop more ordnance on Ouranberg than the entire Imperial operations had done up until that point in the bombing campaign. And it was in this wave that 4 specially equipped Marauders would come in as well, dropping Larisel 1, 2, 3, and 4, along with a lot of munitions. It was assumed that the enemy would not be able to pick out these tiny little grab chutes in amongst the blitz of falling bombs. A reasonable assumption. And just to make triply sure that the enemy figured this to be a regular mass bombing assault, a third wave would then follow it in. Another 200 aircraft, including dive bombers and Marauder Devastators. These would essentially launch dive bombing and strafing attacks on the enemy's positions that had been identified by the preceding waves as particularly vulnerable. It would, granted, mean that Larisel 1 through 4 would be dropping down onto the city even as it was getting pelted by heavy ordnance, but the majority of it would have struck Ouranberg before they landed, and the ordnance that followed up would be mostly precision ordnance, so the risk was assumed to be fairly minor of any blue-on-blue mishaps. The Larisel teams would be introduced onto the target a full day before the main assault, which would occur on the 225th day of the liberation efforts. The main invasion would be guided in by one final massed bombing mission, hoping to knock out the enemy's immediate strongpoints, allowing the infantry to actually land without getting cut to pieces like at Sirin Holm. This time, the dirgers themselves would move in close and begin disgorging troops directly. This was, of course, a huge risk, as the enormous blimp dirigibles would be very, very vulnerable to Ouranberg's guns, but it was assumed that the disgorging process would be quick enough to not put the troops at too great of a risk, and Sirin Holm had demonstrated that fast roping troops out of transports was, not ideal. It took too much time to get the troops onto the deck and left them far too vulnerable while still in the air. Plus, the Imperium had been bombing the absolute living life shit out of Ouranberg for quite some time now, and most of the large guns were, probably, destroyed. Besides, the hope was, as well, that by the time the main assault force actually hit Ouranberg, that the Larisel infiltration teams would have finished their jobs and killed Sagittar Slate, as the assault itself would be quite conventional. One smaller force would set out earlier and then loop around to the west and hit the eastern side of Ouranberg. Their targets would be the main wharfs and the dome structures, and this assault force would be made up mostly of Crassian infantry regiments. The Crassians were newly founded regiments from the world of Crassia, which had very recently been liberated from Chaos occupiers. It had not been under Chaos occupation for too long, and thus they had been able to relatively rapidly create new regiments, as Chaos tends to tear and wear on the population rather severely, but they had been under occupation for more than long enough to develop a healthy hatred of the enemy, and they were now going to get their revenge. The Crassians were eager but unseasoned, and would thus be stiffened up by the addition of Urdeshi regiments, whom it was hoped would form the spearhead for the Crassians to push up behind. Meanwhile, the main assault force would hit Ouranberg at roughly the same time. This would be made up of further Urdeshi regiments, although fewer than had been hoped, and so their numbers would be supplemented with Phantine infantry regiments, a relative rarity as the Phantine do not operate that many infantry regiments. Their imperial tithes are most often paid either in specialist drop troops or in air crews, but there hadn't really been any time to train these specialists, and the air crews were already on station, and so good old-fashioned infantry would have to do. The Urdeshi themselves, of course, had proven their mettle time and time again, and would form the solid core of this assault, and the Tarnith first and only would be deployed along with the main thrust. Though their immediate objective, whilst obviously being the seizure of Ouranberg, and their immediate tactical objectives were also the recovery of Larisel 1, 2, 3, and 4, or the survivors of Larisel 1, 2, 3, and 4, as the infiltration had not gone off quite without a hitch. The Larisel teams had suffered significant casualties, with Larisel 4 being shot out of the air before it even reached Ouranberg. That, incidentally, was the Larisel carrying Scout Surgeon Owen McCull. A big blow to Ibrahim Gaunt, this, as he believed he had lost his chief of scouts. Larisel 4 was not the only one that encountered difficulties, however, as Larisel 1 under Keglan Varl was captured in its entirety, and were dragged out on a sacrificial altar to be bled dry into an enormous ritual cauldron by Sagittar Slate himself. This was being broadcasted on vid screens all across Ouranberg as soon as the Imperial invasion force was detected on long-range augers. This ritual offering was intended to bolster the morale of the Blood Pact troopers and make sure they would fight to the absolute last under Sagittar Slate's command. However, by broadcasting the ritual, Sagittar Slate also broadcasted his location to the other infiltration teams. Now, this seems like a silly thing to do, and indeed it was, but presumably Sagittar Slate assumed that there had only been one assassination team infiltrated into Ouranberg. He was to be proven incorrect. As he was about to begin the sacrificial ritual, he was knocked over by a hotshot las round, fired by Larisel III's Nessa Burrow. But Slate was not quite as stupid as he appeared. He had taken a calculated risk appearing in the open, and he carried with him a personal shield generator. He was knocked over onto his arse, but he was otherwise unharmed. And when a second hotshot las round struck him, this time from the Larisel II sniper Helene Larkin, he remained unscathed. The confusion, of course, was significant, as Blood Pact and Loxl mercenaries immediately rushed to try and hunt down the assassination teams. But in the panic, Larisel I was freed by another hotshot round severing their chains, and Larisel I, along with many of the intended sacrifice victims, were able to escape during the panic and the confusion, even as Sagittar Slate II rushed back into cover, where he encountered another Imperial, one pointing a lasgun at him, Scout Sergeant Owen McCull, who fired his weapon on full auto, splashing harmlessly off Sagittar Slate's shield. Mocking the Tarnith scout, Sagittar Slate advanced upon him. "I am las-proof. You should have been better prepared." Which, of course, was as good an invitation as any in McCall's mind. Stating that he was merely the distraction and telling Slate to check underneath the table, the Scout Sergeant leapt out of view as the Loxl mercenaries opened fire on him, as Sagittar Slate obediently looked under the table to find 6 tube charges with the little green lights just now blinking over to red. And so ended Sagittar Slate's reign over the Phantine people. As predicted, this had devastating consequences on the defenders of Ouranberg. Their central command and headquarters had been, in one swift move, removed from the equation, and due again to the complex nature of the Chaos command structure, there was no immediate replacement to step smoothly into line. And as we saw with Sirin Holm, immediate tactical and strategic rethinking is not one of the Blood Pact's strong suits. And so, now deprived of top-down leadership, they began to break. Although, interestingly, unlike previous Chaos cultist forces encountered, they did not shatter. We have seen previous examples where the followers of a Chaos warlord would be reduced to a catatonic state and simply allow themselves to be slaughtered. On other occasions, they themselves have put their lasguns in their mouths and ended things prematurely, but not the Blood Pact. They may have been deprived of their commander, and thus overall coordination, but they did not give up, and they did not surrender. On a smaller scale, they continued to offer effective and determined resistance against the Imperial invaders, but there was now no coordination, just dozens upon dozens of squads and platoons fighting their own personal private little battles against the overwhelming local numerical superiority of the Imperial Guard. It was yet another painful reminder. The Blood Pact was not the usual enemy, and the usual tactics would not be as effective against them. Furthermore, this was probably not a trick that they could keep relying on. The Blood Pact would surely notice that their leadership had continuously been targeted. The rest of the Chaos Forces as well would probably start noticing this trend and begin putting in place more of an obvious command structure. After all, if the Blood Pact was already attempting to mimic Imperial Guard tactics and organizations, then, well, it was just a question of time until somebody got the clever idea of copying their chain of command as well. But for now, it was another victory for the Imperium. Ouranberg was seized at a fair expense, but significantly cheaper than if they'd had to fight against organized resistance. Although some of the casualties suffered were more painful than others. Gol Collier, one of the leading members of the Verghastite reinforcements of the Tarnith First and Only, and a man who could more than any other unify the Verghastites and the Tarnith, had been injured, severely so. He had caught a blast from a Loxl flechette gun to the back of the head, blowing out a significant portion of his brain. It was a miracle the man was even still alive, but his higher mental faculties had, in essence, disappeared. He was now a well-meaning idiot. Virtually all of his previous knowledge and expertise disappeared, and what remained was a big man who still apparently remembered some of his combat training, but little more. A tragic loss of a fine combat leader. Another casualty that struck at the soul of the Tarnith was the death of Bragg. Affectionately nicknamed Try Again Bragg for his lack of accuracy, which rarely mattered as he was a big enough man to lug around a heavy automated weapon, Bragg had been one of the key pillars of the Tarnith First and Only. He was not an officer, and he was not in any leadership position. He was but a simple trooper, and yet his infectious good humor and his ability to take charge when required had made him a well-known figure. A larger-than-life individual that surely would live forever. Unfortunately, it was not to be so, as Bragg was killed not by the enemy, interestingly enough, but by a fellow member of the Tarnith First and Only, a Verghastite, Lijah Chu, who killed Bragg with a knife. This fact would not become known to the Tarnith until much, much later on, but it's worth mentioning here because Lijah Chu had been slated to be put before an execution squad before the assault on Ouranberg, as he had, provably so, assaulted, raped, and murdered a woman. A crime that another member of the Tarnith First and Only had initially been accused of, Trooper Catherine. However, Gaunt went to great lengths to defend Catherine, and in the light of new evidence, it became apparent that he could not be the culprit. Instead, it seemed almost certain that it was Lijah Chu. The burden of proof had been well and truly met, and Lijah was headed for the wall. Gaunt initially thought this would be the end of it. He had saved the innocent man, Catherine, and he had condemned what appeared to be the guilty man, Lijah Chu. But the problem here was that Catherine was a Tarnith, and Chu was a Verghastite, and the Verghastites had noticed just how hard Gaunt had fought for Catherine's life, and how he appeared to now completely abandon Lijah Chu's. This apparent abandonment was brought up to Gaunt, and he didn't have an adequate explanation for why he would not go to bat for Chu the same way he did for Trooper Catherine. Again, this is one of Gaunt's more strident failings. The pathological need to appear and be perceived as honest and neutral, even in a situation like this, where he knows, and he says so himself, that Elijah Chu pretty much absolutely certainly did it. That Elijah Chu is a bad influence on the regiment, that he is a criminal scumbag, and that the Tarnith would be better off without him. Gaunt knows it was Chu. Imperial Law knows it was Chu. Elijah Chu knows it is Chu. But Gaunt feels the need to prove to the Vergastites that he has their backs as much as he does the Tarnith, regardless of the fact that here we have an example of a man who is innocent and a man who is guilty. This, incidentally, is not an equitable situation. Getting a guilty man off because you got an innocent man off is not fairness. And seeing as, not that long ago, Gaunt himself was willing to execute a man for the mere suspicion of incompetence, yeah, it's not a very good look for the Colonel Commissar. And we'll later on in the story demonstrate yet again that mercy is not a virtue in the 41st millennium, as Gaunt's misguided mercy would get very close to robbing the Crusade of one of its greatest assets. But that is a tale for another time. For now, Ouranberg has been captured. Phantine is one step closer to liberation, and as an added bonus, there was a lot of Promethium to be had. Sagitar Slaith had enslaved the population of Ouranberg and forced them to work 24 hours a day, lacing their food with drugs to keep them awake and productive regardless of the death tolls that this enforced upon the populace. Slaith was bleeding Ouranberg dry and had gathered substantial Promethium reserves that he had not yet been able to move off-world. It might not be the cleanest of resources, but it was a vital strategic addition to the War Master's arsenal right now, as that fuel was desperately needed on many other desperate battlefields where the forces of chaos were trying to tighten the noose around the Crusade's neck. But that too will have to wait until some other time. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.